Hi there. I'm here with Marcell Strbich, who is a candidate for Ohio Secretary of State and going to be our next Secretary of State, right, Marcell?
Better believe it.
I love outsider candidates that are not, heavily connected with the swamp candidate system we typically have going on in Ohio, and I think you're one of those candidates. But what I'd like to do real quick is I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Then I want to talk a little bit about your involvement on maybe not some candidate things, but I know you were involved in some litigation over a Montgomery County issue with the Board of Elections. It's in the wheelhouse of what you're running for. We could talk about some other things going on with boards of elections that I think is a mutual interest. And then we'll talk some about your campaign. But before we go back and start talking about some of the mechanics in the past, why don't you just give everybody a quick introduction of who you are, why you're running for Secretary of State, and then we'll take it from there.
Well, first of all, I'm a husband. I'm a father of 3 young children. I'm living here and now a resident of Ohio. I served in the 9/11 post-war on terror, the entire spectrum of conflict. I saw the forever wars. I lived through them. I've seen how our country has divided on very partisan lines, how people on the inside work with one another to avoid transparency, public oversight, accountability. It disturbed me what I saw in 2020. As an intelligence professional, one of my biggest focuses has always been threat assessments, risk management.
Okay.
And I look at the way we conduct the election systems, and I think, what a joke on a lot of fronts. How people get onto election rolls, how they are not properly validated. You try to bring this up. I mean, you've done exposés. You bring forward a 257 challenge, which is a challenge to a voter record that's inaccurate.
Yeah.
Right. People live out of the state. And what you get is not even a hearing. You don't get the time of day, and then they argue over somebody who's telling them, hey, I'm okay if you take me off the voter roll, and they still won't take them off the voter roll. I mean, the absurdity of it is it's like, and I've been through bureaucracy, Chris. Like I've seen the Air Force at the Pentagon level. Okay. And you joke about it there, but we can't joke about our elections. We saw how bad things went for our country after 2020. Okay.
Right.
We opened a border. We institutionalized, weaponized our institutions from the DOD to the DOJ. People are just complacently sleepwalking, and they have such an ability in our local government, our state government, to be so impactful, so important, that I don't know if they understand just how vital they are. And I think it all stems from the top. So I'm running to be the Secretary of State to clean up these issues, bring a measure of accountability by making sure we have proper organizational leadership. And yes, I've not just said these things, I've done these things as a constituent advocate for over 2 years, till I realized there's nobody
so
to do
you've
it.
made me thinking, and before we jump in deeper into the elections part of it, so the Secretary of State does a variety of things, business formation, being another key aspect of the Secretary of State's office. When I set up Watchdog Wire LLC actually in 2022. Okay. And then I never really did anything with it for several years. And I was impressed, at least it was online, because I had set something up before that and it was still manual paperwork. So before we jump into any election stuff, and I wasn't even thinking to ask you about this, as a Secretary of State candidate, are there, because that's another big part of that office, business formations and corporations, LLCs. Is there any things that you think are hot buttons in that category that need improvement in Ohio?
Yeah, there's always areas for improvement. The areas that people struggle with at times are first-time business owners, because for the Secretary of State, they're processing over 100,000, more than 100,000 applications of new businesses, incorporating the licenses. They're managing trademarks, informing people when those are expiring. So that's a big revenue generator for the state. I mean, if you look at our last budget, it's like $40 million. So that's that business services division. Now, it doesn't get a lot of fanfare because you're facilitating new businesses. You're not creating them. You're ensuring that the people who are creating businesses go through the letter of the law, that they're properly registered, that they'll be properly taxed. So it is an essential part of ensuring that we know who's in our state.
I can say that back some years ago, I thought I was going to have an LLC in Florida and it was all online, and the version in Ohio was not. And then when I did it for this in 2022, it was online. So at least Ohio is where Florida was. And so hopefully we're keeping up, because that's part of being attractive. But let's move on to the election area, because that's
Sure, a lot to talk about.
a hot button thing. And I'm interested because you talk about there's two sides of the equation, which is, which I think are fundamentally broken. There's a lot of things that we're lucky, knock on wood, to have it as good as we have it, right? But there's things about them that are red lights or yellow lights blinking on campaign finance and campaign finance reporting, as well as, it's top of mind for me right now. And it when you said a 257 challenge, boards of elections and the voter rolls. But, campaign finance, and I'm going to work back to your case you had on the Board of Elections in Montgomery County. But campaign finance, obviously, we're fundamentally broken when there's a $61 million Larry Householder bribe scheme. And to this day, where was that money reported? And, I can point out, there's literally in every campaign cycle, there's hundreds of thousands of dollars of help that's never reported anywhere, typically through the big political machines. And we saw that at 10 times multiples under Larry Householder. What's your comment, or when you're running for this office, on that area of campaign finance reporting, which, based on the way they've changed in the budget, the Secretary of State is going to become more important in that role than he is today?
Yeah, absolutely. You see, the Ohio Election Commission is being stood down at the end of this year. So for decades, they had the role or the responsibility to dig through those improprieties and to fine people. Well, as they've accumulated, what is it, Chris? $96 million of unaccounted for,
unpaid, unpaid.
Yeah, unpaid fines. Now that mission is going to go to the Secretary of State's office, which is now going to oversee that. And I'll tell you, one of the things that concerned me in the lead up to me announcing my run for this candidacy is how much power is accumulating in the Secretary of State's office. The budget is $65 million. Okay, let me give you some perspective, and I'll talk campaign finance and what I think we should do. John Husted was the Secretary of State in 2018. He had an $18 million budget. We grew the Secretary of State's budget 325%. Now, that's quite a growth trajectory. And so what did we grow? We grew large bureaucracy there. We have now what's called the Election Integrity Division. Legislature's now given them plenary authority to investigate a range of issues, which will include now campaign finance. My question, and I look 5-10 years down the line as a military officer,
yes, sir,
because I'm not doing this or seeking public office to be in politics for my life.
Politician.
My life's pretty much already set. I've got my title, Lieutenant Colonel, family man. I just don't want to see us go down a road that we can't come back and ever have any oversight of these issues and systems that are important. So when it talk about the campaign finance side, just like voting systems, you've got to have a third-party independent auditor come in that is not affiliated with the Secretary of State.
I couldn't agree more. I could not agree more.
It's what they do in the private sector.
Right.
And so if you're going to put some money on that, then that creates the conditions where all actors, even the ones in our one-party state, are hyper vigilant and they don't want to mess things up. I'm not sure that that's happening. I'm concerned that what will happen is at some point you'll get a Jocelyn Benson type of Secretary of State who's in Michigan, and they will utilize that plenary power that Ohio Republican legislature gave that office, and they will weaponize that. And I'm not even going to go so far.
I think they already do that, by the way. I think in Ohio it already gets weaponized.
Yeah, right. So I'm not even going to go so far as to say that, let's say my candidacy doesn't attain a level of scrutiny. That's why I do everything by the book, very detailed, because I know that for those that would dare come in and challenge that system, they're going to face the greatest amount of scrutiny.
Well, and let me be clear. In my opinion, I'm not putting words in your mouth, is that you're an outsider candidate. If you screw up, you're going to get it weaponized against you. If you are an insider candidate and you do the same messed up thing, you're going to be protected. That is the way that it works in Ohio. And so, and I'll give you an example, and it'll be interesting for you to comment on, with Larry Householder. So what happens in Ohio is we don't have an attorney general's office that ever gets anybody on this stuff. We don't have a secretary of state that really is diligent on it, our boards of elections locally. And so the feds get involved. So Larry Householder gets, so who are the downstream people that weren't involved in the original Larry Householder Fed stuff, okay, that have ever been brought to justice. Where are the second tier people? We have some of in our area, like Steve Caraway, Megan Fitzmartin, people that ran the operation. Not a single one of them was ever held accountable. Actually, if you look at them, they all got job promotions. Megan Fitzmartin became like the top political advisor to Stevens or something. They all got promotions. Stephen Caraway got head of the County Commissioners Association on the Election Commission. And so there's just they just don't do anything that downstream. And last thing I'll say is I was always a fan of G. Gordon Liddy and reading G. Gordon Liddy books. But part of it is when you have a mob that's out of control, you make an example of one or two of them and it causes the behavior to change of the whole mob. And if just one time some of these downstream people got persecuted, it would put a chill on crooked campaign finance stuff in Ohio. My opinion. What's your view on, the state side of Larry Householder or the downstream people that are involved in unscrupulous finance?
Well, clearly I haven't made my way through the Ohio system and been protected over years or been assigned, swap out roles because of my loyalty to the habitual relationships and favor trading that happens in order to stay in the system and not make friction for anybody. But what I can tell you from my military experience when I was leading people in a 120 person level organization, and I saw people that did not follow what was required during the set mission, and you do punish them, you give them a letter of counseling or reprimand. In this case, you could potentially even fire a political appointee.
Yeah.
It does send a message, Chris. In last year, in October, I was a poll worker going for training. We had just a new directive that finally, after 3 years, we had not been enforcing the citizenship requirement before casting. So we conducted 3 elections in Ohio, even though a constitutional ballot amendment passed in 2022, and 77% of Ohioans said, I do not only U.S. citizens should vote in Ohio's elections. We never created a follow-on law to properly evaluate people's at the time of registration to ensure that they were citizens, nor did we give the Board of Elections the means to do so. So they couldn't do that.
And by the way, everything you're talking about would have been on LaRosa's watch that this should have happened?
Whoever's watching, that's right. It should have been done in that period of time since then. But again, what we have in a system is everybody points the finger. The Secretary of State says, the legislature, you got to pass my law. The legislature says, well, you're the Secretary of State. So it's a system of plausible deniability. And it goes all the way up to the federal government when it comes to even the voting system. So to finish my thought and where I was and what I had to do, I felt what I had to do. As a polling location worker, and we had been raising awareness about how many non-citizens had been granted identity credentials in Ohio. At the time, it was 236,000, which means those are 236,000 potential instances where somebody working for a government office or a third-party voter group could ask a non-citizen, do you want to register to vote? And if that non-citizen doesn't admit and they choose to just proceed with it, there wasn't really a mechanism, and it still isn't today, which is what's absurd about this, to be able to qualify if their statement is truthful or not.
So was this, I know you had a Montgomery County case that had to do with the Board of Election not following directives, even directives from, and so was that case tied to this, or what was the deal with that case?
The deal was, as a poll worker, they were supposed to train me and every poll worker the month prior to the 2024 election to look on the back of the driver's license for the citizen designated marking, non-citizen marking. And even though Secretary of State did send the directive and the infographic, which they were supposed to use in the training, what I found in my county, Montgomery, very large county, Dayton, Ohio, and several other counties across the state of Ohio, to include Fairfield and others, they were completely ignoring that component of training, even though they had been in a constitution for years.
So when I look at the back of my driver's license, there's something on there that would indicate whether I was a U.S. citizen or not?
Yes, here's the kicker, though. Only the driver's licenses that were issued after April 7th, 2023, which is when they snapped the chalk line for the voter ID bill that they passed a few years ago. You know what the problem with that is? The problem is there's millions of driver's licenses and state IDs which were issued without that designation prior to April of 2023, and it's going to take several years for the people who were attesting to their citizenship for that to cycle out.
So your case was about not doing the proper training, and then you it looked like when I looked at it, it was one of these typical writ granted, partially part of it was muted. So did Montgomery County then do some training, or what actually happened?
Yeah, the interesting thing is they were backslapped from the Supreme Court, but this is what they said. As long as they sent an email to the other prior hundreds of attendees, that would suffice as far as remediating it. So I said, an email? Really? Like I would have, brought people back. And so
Right.
they try to accommodate everything. And
Well,
the direct
it tells you how much, that you can't, I'm a big believer in what Dan Bongino used to say. Most Republicans are, in the political class, most Republicans are actually Democrats and no Democrats are Republicans. And so you cannot trust that because somebody has an R behind their name, that's something that they campaigned on or they talk about of voter integrity, not, citizens only voting, that they actually do anything about it. They do not ever assume that any of these people in office have the passion for the things they talk about on the campaign trail. But I can already tell talking to you, you have a passion about this, that we need to have clean elections in Ohio.
Oh, 100%. And I'm not trying to affect an outcome for a given party. I don't want people to lose confidence and trust in their elections. I don't know if you know this, but prior to the 2024 election, polling was done on this, showing 6 out of 10 Americans were not sure if the results of the election would be honest. That's a crisis. And that's not all Republicans. Those are independents. Those are Democrats. Ever since I've been of voting age, which started in 2000 with the Bush versus Gore election, which I believe started us down this path of non-accountability and the election systems being privatized and monetized and brought behind closed doors for the parties to control. I'm a firm believer that things went sideways on that front. And if we go back and diagnose it, all we really have is whenever the other side loses, a Republican or a Democrat,
right,
they blame the other side for cheating.
Right.
And so the people get lost in the confusion of the narrative.
And nothing gets fixed. Nothing gets really changed. And I want to give a parallel. It's kind of like, I love to say this, especially with young people and especially with liberal ones, when they talk about college and student loan forgiveness. And I say, okay, let's put that shiny object over here. Like, who won Bush versus Gore? Who won Trump versus, let's put that shiny object over here. And let's ask ourselves a question first. If we have a system where people can't pay back their college loans, what are we doing to fix the system? Forget about whether we forgive the past loans. How are we making sure the problem's not persisting? And so the political class on elections, it's a lot of talk. It's a lot of this. It's a lot of that. What does happen? What doesn't happen? But you don't see really effective people really proposing solutions. In the mix. So, what do you think if you had to say like your couple 3 things about voter registration and or elections in Ohio that you think are the most important couple 3 things need to get more focus on?
We could solve 80 to 90% of potential fraudulent voting by addressing the broken election administration review of voter registration applications.
Okay.
Let me break it out. We essentially let everybody who applies for any application that comes forward to the Board of Elections that's been filled out to go through and get a voter ID number. Think about that. The industry standard is to make sure the information is correct before you process a transaction.
Correct, right.
But for voter registration, the standard, the criteria, which is determined by every county, not by one standard, but by every county, is if they're satisfied as to the statement of the truth. Think about what that means. That means that whoever's sitting there pushing that paper in front of them says, okay, is fields A through Z filled out? It is? Good. I'm inputting it and let the Secretary of State and the Bureau of Motor Vehicles figure it out. So what that leads to is the following. Inevitably, tens of thousands of those registration records that now have voter ID numbers, which means they're legitimate in terms of getting access to a regular or mail-in ballot, have never been fully qualified for eligibility. To me, that is the biggest mortal sin of this system, is that we have not equipped the County Board of Elections, number one, with identity, residency, and citizenship information, even though we are swimming in this society in data. and it would be lucrative. This is the
Right.
funny part about it. It would be lucrative for companies to provide the commercial identity evaluation services,
Right.
which is what the election systems are about, making money for a lot
Well,
of different people.
just think how many systems there are, like somebody getting a car loan or something like that are out there that verify somebody's identity real time, almost real time in that mix. So that front end, what's so funny is I see, like, I've had issues with the Hamilton County Board of Elections, the Claremont County Board of Elections, and the Adams County Board of Elections, all three. And it's interesting to see they just have wildly different interpretations of what they're supposed to do. And I'll give you an example that's not one of my Aaron Haslam examples, is that if somebody doesn't file a campaign finance report on time, okay, is Brown County, I know because I asked them, and I believe Adams County also, but Brown County for sure, they contact the candidate because they call them up and say, hey, we didn't get your report. And if the person's like, if it's not a habitual problem, the person be like, oh shit, I forgot to, and they'll give them like 48 hours. Okay. Which I have no problem with that. Other counties like Claremont seem like they sometimes give people time to fix it. Other times, if it's somebody like me, I'm going to get immediately referred, so it seems very uneven how, and I don't know if there's nobody's keeping any statistics. When you're Secretary of State, there should be some statistics on this stuff somewhere of what's actually happening with this stuff. Because I think you have some counties, they just have radically different interpretations. And I'm going to make one other statement and then let you go at it. It's kind of like in Adams County, I'm trying to get a hearing on somebody who says they have an apartment where they don't use enough water to be taking a shower in the apartment. So they don't use enough water. The water records, when you're a member of the press, you can get water records from municipalities. So they clearly can't be living there full time or any notable amount of time in there. And then they interpret the statute. You're probably familiar with it. It says based solely on the records of the board. They interpret that as that's all they look at. We only look at our own records. And so any outside evidence in there, but the whole like hodgepodge of how boards of elections interpret stuff, how they act, the kind of people on them, just help us all to understand under your administration how you would try to, what you see as the big issues and how you would try to address them.
The big issue is we've got to invert where the current emphasis is. I'm going to talk real quick registration and shift to some of those points about inconsistency in application of the law and interpretation of the law. We've got to take it away from a central focal point like Secretary of State, and we got to push the functionality and the mandate down to every county board of election with clear criteria and standards by which they're supposed to evaluate, whether those be incidents that are occurring at the polling location with malfunctioning voting systems. Nobody tracks that on election day. There's situations that go unreported about problems with voting machines because nobody creates an incident report. Who would have thought it's so difficult to create an incident report, which then you can review and hot wash after an election? It's like they don't want to have to necessarily trouble them. They just kick it to the vendor, and the vendor wants to sweep that under the rug and move forward. When it comes to issues like we're talking about on how we're going to look at the other aspects, that's registration, the voting system, 257 challenges. We had people trying to show every board of election to be helpful to them, knowing they didn't have the capability to see that themselves because they haven't been equipped with that data in those databases to know, would show up last summer with lists diligently prepared, diligently researched, Chris, showing this person clearly moved from Ohio to Florida and has even voted in Florida, right? And then they would show them .gov data. Like, you can't get more official than like Florida's data. And they would bring it forward. And the county board of elections were like, first they wouldn't give them the 10-day hearing. Then when they got around to it, they didn't want to say it was a formal hearing. The gamesmanship, the animus that was portrayed toward these people for daring to try to involve themselves in an activity that has been in an Ohio law for 20 years as an option for them. And they refused to do it. In fact, there were some county board of elections, they basically flatlined. The 2 Democrats and the 2 Republicans wouldn't agree. So what that does is it kicks it up to the Secretary of State. Now, if I'm the Secretary of State and I'm facing that issue, that signals to me like, hello, it's time for you to come up with some defined criteria. because
Right.
clearly these people don't know how they should decide this. So if they need me to spell it out for them, A to Z, right, nuts and bolts,
Right.
what you're going to determine that off of, then let's come up with that. And if you want me to do your job and I'll promulgate it to you, then I'll hold you accountable for you executing on that or not. It's a failure, and I saw this in the military. It's a failure when you have to send your issue up to the general officer or your senior master sergeant. You got to be able to take care of those things at your level. But I also have to say, some of those board of elections have been left in this no man's space where they don't know how to react to this. Let me give you another perfect example. There was a ballot referendum by two rural counties recently, Monroe and Seneca, to bring forward a referendum this November so that they can restore hand counting. All they wanted to see was if 51% of the county wants to do hand counting. That doesn't mean it's binding. It's not binding. It's a plebiscite to see if people want to go that direction. And even if it said yes, there's a whole other set of actions that have to happen. Okay, how are you going to do it? Let's see your plan, so forth, so on. Well, the Secretary of State decided selectively to get involved there, where he didn't get involved in the 257 challenges, but he got involved on that case. And he said that the form they're using to get those signatures and citing the statute is non-applicable, and he disallowed the ballot referendum. So it gets worse. So he steps in, but it's an advisory memo, right? So there's a questionability about the legality. Is that true legality? But what it is it's a dog whistle for the county prosecutors now to pounce on that because people needed top cover, and they sure did. And in that county, the Board of Elections decided to take it a step further and pass a rule that punished anybody who participated in that ballot referendum from ever being able to be a supervisor voting location manager. So in other words, their views or opinions as expressed with the type of voting system they want to have is somehow so forbidden that they can no longer be trusted, even though they've demonstrated exceptional performance, election after election, no issues, nothing insubordinate. Right. So they took it upon themselves to violate their First Amendment and discriminate across an entire class.
I believe that most, I think that a lot of people in government in these different public things, they know the systems are effed up. So they react. It's funny, any company I ever worked for, I was never afraid of inspection because if we actually had a problem, I wanted to find out where we had a problem.
Exactly.
And I never went into an inspection without feeling that I didn't have any problems. You know what I'm saying? Or if I did have a problem, I would tell them we got a problem here that we're trying to figure out, because that was a professional. I was a professional. And so these boards of elections. So let me give you an example. I worked for Anderson Consulting, now Accenture, and they did peer office reviews where people came from another office to review your office. And you wanted them to do that because if you had a liability exposure, you're screwing something up on projects, you're not testing something right. You wanted to know that. You never thought, but you had the maturity to know that there's things that I might not see because I have, I'm living this every day. Third party comes in, So frankly, I see there's no audit function. And the people that I see on boards of elections, I'm not saying they're bad people, but 90% of them are not qualified to be in those roles. I don't know if you saw, I did a thing where I asked one of the Adams County Board of Election members, like, why didn't you look at the water usage? Why didn't you look at why the vehicles were registered in another county? Why didn't you look at why his own form says he lives with his wife and kids? And the guy looks at me like, those would be good questions. It's like, what? Like, you're on a board of elections. These should be the natural questions that are in your mind that would go to residency. Where's their cars? Where's their kids? Where's their wife? Do they use enough water? And I just feel like these people on these boards of elections, they might be nice people. They might be good to hang out with, go to church with, hang out socially. But a lot of them don't seem like they have any real analytical skills. And you should have a little bit of a detective skill if you're on a board of elections.
Yeah, I think a lot of times what's happened is there's a conditioning process here too. And I've seen this with bureaucracies or middle management. Don't ask too many questions. This is your lane in the road. If something goes wrong, you can always fall back on, well, that wasn't my job.
Or I did. Plausible denial.
Yeah, that's the plausible deniability, right? Like, I go around all over the state, Chris, and I talk to people about legitimate security vulnerabilities that exist with the present, product line of voting systems. They go back to 2005 in terms of the security standards. And what you'll find is when you bring this up, I'll usually be in the presence of some Board of Election members. And like you said, I don't bring them up specifically. I don't ever question anything specific to their county or their thing. But I find so many people get quickly defensive for something they have nothing to do with. They're not. I'm not putting it on you.
It's because they're government people and they know there's something wrong with it, right?
Right? But it's almost like people's identities are self-prescribed in their jobs. And they've been told, like, you should always fall back on the 99.95% accuracy talking point, or the voting systems are not connected to the internet. And I find with that, when I hear that, I say, okay, but do you understand that those systems were designed and developed by a foreign entity through foreign developers with foreign supply components, and that the degree of threat that exists today with voting systems isn't just about network connectivity, that it has a lot to do with supply chain, that it has a lot to do with remote access, that there are so many vectors of access points, and not to manage, to say also password administration access. Chinese have gotten into the Department of Defense's top systems basically because of sloppy password administration management and user access. Do we think that the DoD is doing is more complacent or much more scrutinous than the Board of Elections could be? I think they take what they hear from the vendor at face value because it's easier to live in that world than it is to question it, to try to understand it. Right. And I don't blame people for not having an information system technology background like I do, or having worked through those things, but that's what I think I have to offer. I can get at the crux of that issue, and we can create a solid system that includes some technology that is risk mitigated, right? Using risk management framework principles, which I understand. And you can have the very simple pen and paper, hand-marked paper ballot, which is watermarked, can get the job done for a lot less, and people will be assured and know that their vote is what it is because they filled it out with a pen and paper versus it got put into a barcode or a QR code that they have no viewability for.
Right. I just did out my calculator because my brain has gotten weak as I've gotten older. That 88 counties, 4 members of the boards of elections, that's 352 people. There should be something they're doing when they put these people on these boards of elections. I think about, like, how the interview process worked in Accenture. There were some questions that would be revealing of your critical thinking skills, your problem solving skills, and this should apply to our government. I get so irritated. I'm sure the military used a lot of those kind of concepts of how do we know a person that can be at a certain level, but the lack of kind of critical thinking skills. And you wonder, what if something was really happening? What if somebody came into Adams County and they were actually none of these people would ever notice because they can't even, the obvious things right in their face, they don't even question. And it's just scary to think that it could be that our elections could be bastardized by, at all levels, poor registration, poor training, people on boards that don't have the cognitive skills or the critical thinking skills to really dig into things that are look for the threats. I don't understand why in our board of elections, I've run reports, you've probably done this, where you can see, you look at addresses, how many people are registered at the address, how many of this, how many of that. You can see the clues are not hard to find. And you can tell cross-reference, well, this one has a lot, but it's a retirement home. So that's a different scenario. Then why does this, I want you to talk, not me, but I remember once campaigning and going door to door, and I was hitting houses that had lots of registered voters. I go to this house that had 6 registered voters. And it looked like an abandoned house. It was no curtains in the windows, no nothing. It's like, how does this have 6 active voters? And last thing, then I'm going to shut up. In Adams County, the former prosecutor, David Kelly, was registered in Arizona simultaneously with being registered in Ohio for 2 years. Okay, so when you have the higher ups that should know better, right? A prosecutor, and that sends a signal. If prosecutors can do it, illegals can do it. Everybody can do it. Just do your own thing. React to anything you want to react about what I just said.
The laws don't preclude or don't prohibit or don't set a standard for how many people can be registered in Ohio. I've seen a halfway house in Cleveland with 400 registrants, and they have maybe 200 beds. So, and I've seen people registered at U.S. postal offices. And so we track this. The fortunate thing about Ohio, and I'm sure it had a lot to do with where Republicans were 20 years ago, but the voter records are free. So we're unlike other states that charge us. We're one of the best when it comes to being able to see this stuff from a public record standpoint. I won't say, though, that the Board of Elections are quick to react to that. I think they're waiting for the Secretary of State to say or do something because that's the way they've been conditioned, right? Because I think that in the past, what has happened is they've done some things to try to get ahead of these problems with voter list maintenance, and they did something errantly, maybe, right? Willingly or unwittingly, and then they got schwacked. Right. And when you get beat down once, then that sticks, and then the Secretary of State takes heat because that's a political position in many ways. The way that position reacts is politically. And so at that point, they're thinking, okay, well, let's just wait till the Secretary of State tells us what to do. So the whole idea that we're using a bottom-up elections approach in the fact that we have laws that say you can challenge voter registrations, but you don't see the actualization of that has a lot to do with the politics, the culture that is in place based on who the Secretary of State is. If the Secretary of State says, you will never remove a voter from the rolls until I tell you, and then he creates a process where he does it once a year, it's big fanfare, it has a bunch of PR record releases, Ohio removed 200,000, then guess what that's going to lead the 88 County Board of Elections to do? I'm going to wait till the Secretary of State tells me to do my job. Now, if you have a Secretary of State like me that says, no, I'm going to give you the tools. I'm going to give you the mandate. I'm going to check on you on a monthly basis to see how you're doing I'm going to utilize the tools I have to see how you're doing. Okay. And then those of you who are performing well, I'm going to incentivize, maybe bonuses or other things. Right. And those of you who are not, are going to need to look for new.
So just so anybody who watches this is aware, because you said something important, people don't know this. You can go download the voter database in Ohio anytime you want. You might need to have a decent enough computer if you live in a big county to handle the spreadsheets, but you can go download spreadsheets for every county off of the Secretary of State site. I could give them a lot of it. When you're in office, I'm going to give you some advice on how to clean up the formatting of that crap so it's usable, okay, more usable, but it's all there. And just so another thing, just because you made me think about it, I'm going to say here, I don't know, we get people in school at 12 years of public education or public or private education, is that in Ohio, unless you vote in a party primary, you are considered no party. Okay, so you are an independent unless you vote in the party primary. You don't register as a Republican or as a Democrat.
That's right.
That's an offshoot of your behavior in a party primaries. And you're right. And people know every county, if you hear this, you can go out to the Secretary of State's database right now as you're hearing this and download your county file and start sorting it, start working it to look for these things, look for the duplication across things. And it's very easy to do in Ohio. In Florida, I did that and I had to you end up getting, I don't know if I had to pay, but you end up having to wait for DVDs in the mail and stuff like that. You have to get records in the mail. So it's much harder. In Arizona, it's very hard. I had to go get the voter record for David Kelly in Arizona. It's like a person one at a time to get any voter information in there. So before we wrap up, because I just thought about this, you might have been involved. Were you involved in 20 or 22 with any efforts to try to get voter information related to those elections? There were people.
I know a number of team members, volunteer that are and are still very involved, and they look at it in 2-year increments, so they can see the change.
Okay. There's people that are on top of that, and they want to get information from boards of elections. So in Claremont County, where I live, somebody tried to do that. Not me. And our chief of our civil division prosecutor's office, Brian Strbich, told him they'd have to pay $30,000 to get the public records from the election. At least $30,000. And I'm like, what? And then I called up people I knew, like John Adams and stuff, that had been involved in, this stuff. I hadn't. And I'm like, did you ever get any counties tell you had to pay some outrageous amount of money? No, not a one. So then I made the same record request. I eventually got the records, and I had to spend, I think, $5 for a memory stick was all I had to pay. But just so you know, if you come to me, if you see this, Michael, when he's in office, Marcell, when he's in office, you can come to him, but come to me. If anybody tells you at a board of elections you have to pay some outrageous amount of money to get election records, that is bullshit, and I will help you. So,
Yeah.
But that happened in Claremont County. Have you heard of that happen in other counties that people
that one, no. That one, no. I mean, even the Secretary of State's clear when he says that this isn't costing folks. And some states are trying to create laws like that, and so they can be more like Ohio. That's a battle. That's one of many battles going on nationally.
Actually, in Ohio, it's getting worse every year, but our public records laws in Ohio are getting worse, and we need to move them back the other direction. But there's a lot of states where they're even worse, okay, like than in Ohio, where government tries to hide all of its information. Okay, so Marcell, I appreciate you taking the time with me. Let me give you time for you to just talk about, anything you want to talk about, but you probably want to talk about your campaign, or how do people find you?
Yeah.
You're not a big connected guy, so if people want to give money to your campaign, how do they do that, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, thanks. And I've enjoyed this. This is good. I am on X at Marcell Strbich, 2 L's. It's Strbich. And I'm on Facebook, Marcell Strbich for Ohio. We've got our campaign website, which is Strbich for Ohio, spelled FOR, spelled out. And yes, I mean, I'm asking every single Ohioan, look, you've been watching this carousel game of Ohio Republicans maybe for the last 2 or 3 decades, right? And a lot of people are good people or nice people, however you want to, delineate them. But they're not always the right person for the right job at the right time. We have a president that's called on Ohio to do more to close these voter vulnerabilities and risks and weaknesses in our system, get on top of it. And we're going to have a new governor, and he's going to need people that are going to come in with an outsider perspective and that have an industry background, that have a military background. I'm uncompromising in terms of my principle to address these issues. It's the only job I would even consider running for public office right now, even though people have told me, yeah, why don't you do it at the local level? Why don't you go in the legislature? No, because this is the greatest need. And I'm the type of person, the way I joined the military after 9/11, I go to where the greatest need is. Our country is either going to survive or be torn apart on the basis of the election systems and the outcomes of them. And if you need any evidence of it, all you need to do is remind yourself about 2020, which I lived through the heart of in the DC area. And I watched the military get deconstructed into DEI instead of merit. And so that really activated me to get out there and realize, okay, so you've been 20 years apolitical, but now you're out. Now you have to do something at a local or statewide level. So I jumped into this. And if I felt that there was a better candidate, Chris, who had my conviction, had my knowledge set, had followed and worked on these issues for 2 years, and would be willing to move in the direction or take my advisement and have the chutzpah to do it, I would be happy to just support them, raise my young family, and not, deploy to Columbus, where I'm sure it will be lonely for somebody like myself to operate in that space, considering everyone's going to be wanting a status quo. So this is your opportunity. I'm the only race in May of 2026 that is unique in this way, that hasn't been christened by somebody within the party or hasn't been predetermined or handpicked to run. And I honestly think we have a great shot because the people we're running up against don't have the name ID. They don't have a record of doing it much in 20 years. And the electorate just doesn't care anymore.
Well, it's also musical chairs.
Approval.
It's musical chairs. The qualification for a lot of these offices in Ohio and for the insider ORP people is my term limit is up in one office. So now I'm all of a sudden the right candidate for another office.
Right.
And I love that. I love Vivek is breaking that. I'd love for you to break that too, is that it's not just move, because your opponent is Robert Sprague, who's coming from termed out at treasurer. And now all of a sudden you're termed out at treasurer, so now you naturally should just be some other position.
Listen, they should want the job. It's not an easy job. They should want it to do something and affect positive change. Instead, the gentleman in question first announced running for governor. So he really wants to stay in the system to get a shot at that someday. So if you want to stay electable, what do? If you're a politician, you're a career politician, you want to not make friction. You want to not do anything controversial. Well, we've allowed this situation has devolved into this after 20 years because everybody stepping into this role doesn't want to take on friction. So this is why we have the system that we have. So the only way you break it is you bring somebody in from the outside with clarity, vision, conviction, competence,
Right. That could be
and you let
Vivek,
them
Donald
go at
Trump,
it, and you surround them with people like that. And that's how we're going to start moving the dial, which we haven't been doing in Ohio for the better part of 2
So in
decades.
closing, I see you wearing a Charlie Kirk shirt.
Yes.
And and I'd say, and I mean this in a positive way. I tell people, like, people talk about Charlie Kirk's Christianity, and I say there's lots of people who are Christians that are notable Christians. He brought pizzazz to it by being able to go into the lion's den and debate people and discuss ideas and not be afraid to talk to your enemies, and engage them and still love them even though they're, that kind of thing. So, are you of the Charlie Kirk school where if Robert Sprague would offer to you to do 5 debates across the state, you'd be glad to do that?
Man, we make it like a Lincoln Douglas thing.
Lincoln Douglas, right?
We go Lincoln
Robert
Douglas
Sprague.
1856 on him if we had to, Chris.
Yeah,
no,
I
think,
wouldn't
I
you
think
love?
He doesn't want to be in a place that I'm in. I don't see why not. I think our ideas need to be, if anything, anybody going up against a Democrat needs to sharpen.
Absolutely. This is why primaries are so important.
Exactly.
Because at some point, the facade of the ORP will fall out from under it, because something will happen at some point because we don't really get people to be sharpened. I heard somebody in the Claremont County party about, primaries are just a waste of money of Republicans going against Republicans. I'm like, well, if that was the case, Hillary Clinton would have been president because Jeb Bush would have been the candidate in the 2016 primary. The primary is what makes your party interesting. The primary is what helps your voters to learn. Yes. To get them interested. In Ohio, we have a declining participation in primaries all the time, and that needs to get reversed by people like, you're not going to be the problem, but people like Robert Sprague embracing the idea that real voter education through candidate engagement and interaction is good for our society, win or lose. And win or lose, I guarantee you, whether you win or lose, if Robert Sprague did 5 debates with you across the state, and then even if he won, okay, he would be a much better Secretary of State for having had to go through 5 debates with somebody presenting ideas and making him have to think through all these things.
And I'd be there to support and help to achieve the outcome or mission because I'm a mission-driven candidate. I'm not here to get into office. So, that's the whole purpose is we're driving that hard. That's why we got people noticing this campaign. I think we're going to have some very high-level endorsements coming up. I look forward to sharing that with my support base and also building upon that. I'm all over the state. I've been almost to, I think, around a third of the counties thus far. I do 3 or 4 events every week. I'm working for it. I've got the ideas, the vision, and I've got the will, most importantly.
And where do you live? You told me this, but where do you live? What area of the state?
I'm outside of Dayton. I'm in the Dayton.
Okay, so you're kind of in at least in the southwestish Ohio quadrant in that. So you're in the same quadrant that I am. So, okay. Well, anything else? Any last closing comment?
No, I appreciate it. Keep up the good work. We need people to shine light on everything, and people need to start, seeking to answer questions. We serve at the government to behest the people. We have to remember that. And I look forward to following your work and seeing this platform grow. Great job.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time. So Marcell Strbich, the candidate for Ohio Secretary of State, and I think you got to practice that a couple times. Before we hang it up, say your name 3 times just so everybody can remember it.
Marcell Strbich, Marcell Strbich, Marcell Strbich.
Marcell Strbich. Now, Sprague has a name too. His is easier to flow, So Marcell Strbich, you got to make it. Everybody's got to at least remember that name and at least consider you. And may the best man win in the primary. Thank you very much.